Do you think that there was an overreaction to what happened at Glastonbury?
Yes.
You do?
Yes. I say this as someone who is Jewish, and so I recognise that anti-Semitism needs to be taken really seriously. I also think, in a totally separate conversation, the undertones behind what happened to Glastonbury have serious chilling effects for artists' right of freedom of expression. As I went to see Kneecap, and they said on stage, was in a few years' time, when history looks back, people will wonder how people had a microphone in front of them at Glastonbury. And even if they weren't going to give a huge political speech, there wasn't a mention from some artists about what's happening in Palestine, what's happening across the world. And that will seem odd to people. It will seem odd to people that people didn't use their platform in this moment to speak out.
Britain is shattered. We're giving up on traditional politicians. We're giving up on belief in our institutions. We're giving up believing even that the cost of living will ever improve. Those are the findings of a new piece of work by the polling company More in Common. And it raises serious questions for what mainstream parties must do if they want to bring the public with them.
Because the party that is clearly on the rise in the UK at the moment is Reform. So is conventional politics dead? Labour, Conservative? And if you want to beat populism of the right, do you now need to have a populism of the left? Welcome to the Newsagents. It's John.
It's Emily.
And it is a truism to say politics has become more divided and people have become angrier and there's polarisation. And we've seen it in America and we're seeing it in Britain, and it has sort of been quantified in a major piece of polling research done by More in Common, which is a sort of anatomy of Britain today and our attitudes and the tribes that we fall into.
Some of the headlines of this report will really make you pause to take breath. 87% of people asked say they have little or no trust in politicians, i.e. not just one type of politician, but politicians per se. There's a question about who you would ask to watch your bag, which party leader you'd ask to watch your bag, and none of the current leaders even come out of that well. 36% in the More in Common work say that the COVID pandemic was exaggerated to control people. So that is more than 1 in 3, more than a third of this country believes what we were told about the pandemic was not as real as the government was making out. It asks questions not on a left to right axis, but more in terms of where you sit on social issues, what you prioritise, what you think is important, where you think the country is heading. And it comes back with some pretty depressing stats, actually. One of the most depressing is the number of people who think that they are stuck in a cost of living spiral that will not end. And so I guess we were talking about this earlier. You might talk about shattered Britain or broken Britain, or you might say this country's fucked, isn't it? And you might mean something completely different to what the person next to you means, even though they thoroughly agree. So we're going to talk to Luke Tryl now from More in Common, who's put this work together, is looking sort of both radiant and shattered. And I guess, I want to start there, Luke, because I guess some of it is about language, isn't it? Some of it is about the narrative that once people start talking to their neighbour about how terrible the country is, then everyone wants to join in how terrible the country is, even though they might be talking at odds with each other.
Yeah, completely. And, we've known from a while from our focus group research and polling that we've done that there is just this pervasive sense that the country is on the wrong track, that something is going quite wrong for the country, even if on lots of other headline figures we might be doing quite well. People's perceptions, people's view is the country isn't working for me. But what's interesting, and as the report shows, is when you actually dig into that, when you start to chat to people, is people actually have quite different reasons for thinking that the country is on the wrong track. Quite different reasons for thinking that it's not going in the direction that they thought it should go or they thought it would be going. So we're kind of united by this sense of, I think what we call in the report, sort of malaise about the state of the country. But we don't necessarily have a shared diagnosis. And I think this is the really important part of the diagnosis, you might assume that there's a left-wing diagnosis and there's a right-wing diagnosis. Actually, there's not even that. There are multiple axes, multiple points where different groups who might agree on one cause of the problems then totally disagree on another area. So we describe it a bit more like a kaleidoscope, where different people come together on certain issues and then disagree on others. And the report is trying to get under the skin of that and provide, I guess, a new political and social map of Britain that then hopefully other people can use to try and get us out of the mess.
And let us try and we'll disentangle the various bits of what that map looks like in a moment. I suppose there has never been an occasion since opinion polling began where if you ask the questions, do you think politicians are wonderful, you'd get a majority saying yes. But equally, a corollary of what we've got today is the extent to which people think politicians are shit and have an untrustworthy and unable, untrustworthy is not new, but unable to do anything that will
Nearly
make things
90%,
better.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that is staggering.
Actually, a degree of cynicism in politicians, probably quite healthy, right? Quite normal. I think what is different and what comes out of this report is that people no longer think politicians even have the answers to get us out of the mess that we're in. And one of the sort of key divides, actually, that the report uncovers is there is a group of people, still the majority, who say what we need to do is improve our institutions, we need to make them better. But there's another group, and it's now around 2 in 5, who are more likely to say, no, I'm not into that preserving and improving. I'd just like to see them burn. That's the actual poll question that we use in there. And that is quite bad because they're convinced that politicians have, to use that phrase, lost control. And actually, that's one of the themes that comes out throughout of the report, this sense that government can't do the things we thought it should be able to do, which is get me a GP appointment, make sure my bills aren't too high, control the border, deal with things like climate change.
You list a whole variety of different things that government can't cope with. The change in attitudes towards government, towards politicians. I mean, Emily kind of in that introduction briefly mentioned COVID. Did a lot change with COVID where people suddenly, were very rule-obeying in this country and now feel you sold us a pup on vaccines, you sold us a pup on school closures, you didn't care for people in the way...
Why on vaccines? We're not vaccine sceptic in this country.
Well, there's more vaccine scepticism than there was. We've had the first case of someone dying of measles, in Liverpool, and you just think, Christ, does this all come back from the measures that were taken in 2020?
I think it is definitely partly that. And when there's one of the new tribes that we identify, which is very much shaped by the pandemic and this experience, they're a younger group who sort of say, well, I missed out on the best years of my life. And during that time, politicians were partying or they were giving contracts to people that they shouldn't have been. It's made them really angry and made them much more likely to say, actually, in their own words, I want to find my own truth. Going forward, which leads them down some of that conspiracy thinking. So I definitely think that's part of it. But there's a wider thing. And actually the main reason we redid this segmentation and redid this mapping is because it's not just our relationship with politicians that's changed. It's how we socialise. It's where we get our information from. It's how we work as well. The whole sort of actual social makeup of Britain has changed because of the pandemic, and that's really affecting public attitudes. There is a bright spot, though, that whilst trust in politicians is very low, one of the things which jumps out of the report is how high trust in scientists remains. In fact, every one of the tribes that we're going to talk about says that they still trust in science, which, might sound like a low baseline, but actually compared to some of the other countries we work in where science has become very politicised, it's a good foundation.
And trust in neighbours is very high, which I guess if you were a politician, you'd think, I have to root everything we do in community and in local work because that's how the message is spread, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So people have these sort of negative images of what we call kind of the vertical, the relationship between people and institutions. But the horizontal with one another is much stronger than that. And actually, we have a word cloud in the report. We ask people, describe Britain in a word. Top word is broken, that's shambles, mess. We ask people to describe their local area and they say quiet, good, nice. So there's a big disconnect there. And I think if there is a sort of takeaway for politicians and other institutions that want to get us out of the malaise, it's got to start from building up.
Can I ask you something that I think is central to where this takes us, which is disillusionment with institutions and the mainstream parties? Now, we've talked quite a lot over the last year about the rise of reform. Do you think that this becomes a battle between right-wing populism and left-wing populism, ultimately? Do the mainstream parties just fade into the background and leave the populist parties to battle this one out?
If the mainstream parties don't show that they can provide an answer to the problems, I think that is what will happen. You will see the let's burn it all down sentiment grow. You see it particularly grow on the right, but you also see it grow on the left as well. People saying the established structures aren't working. And one of the things, and this is an area where left and right doesn't divide people. There is instead just more people on both wings, both the traditional wings, saying, I want to roll the dice. I want to roll the dice on something else because, it might be a risk. It might end up being worse, not better. But actually, it's difficult to see how it can be worse than what we've got now. And I think the challenge for the mainstream is to show government can do what people want from government.
We've spoken for a few minutes now about the sort of, about some of the features of the report. And we keep referring to these 7 tribes. Probably a good idea for you to spell out.
Go for it.
Go for it. Come on. Just list the 7 tribes.
So these 7 tribes we have a set of questions which aren't based on demographics. They're not based on partisan beliefs. They're based on kind of upstream values, social psychology, things like moral foundations, attitudes to authoritarianism, something that's called need for chaos as well. And it brings out these 7 groups. And so they are, the first group is progressive activists. They are the most kind of liberal, left-leaning group, very motivated by social justice issues, tend to think globally rather than locally, and also tend to be outliers on lots of social issues, particularly immigration. There's a group we call the incrementalist left. They share a lot of the values of progressive activists. They're about 20% of the population. Progressive activists a bit smaller, around 12%. But the incrementalist left aren't as political. And they're more in favour of kind of gradual change. They're actually quite conflict averse. They tend to step out of
they don't tweet about politics.
They don't tweet about politics, but they have tended to vote for Labour. The exception was 2019 when they tied between Labour and the Conservatives, in part because some of the incrementalists left didn't like Corbyn, some wanted Brexit done. Established Liberals, which is a sort of comfortable, optimistic group. We sort of think of the sort of blue wall of Britain, more economically right in that they believe in individual agency, but also quite socially liberal. Traditionally, lots of them voted for the Conservatives, but at the last election, more went to Labour and the Liberal Democrats. The Sceptical Scrollers, they are a group that I was referring to earlier who've been really shaped by the pandemic. Very online. And I think traditionally you'd call them politically disengaged because they're the group least likely to vote. But actually they're sharing a lot of political content on things like TikTok and other outlets. So they're actually quite engaged just in a new way. More likely to think the social contract is broken, more likely to, as I say, want to find their own truth. Rooted Patriots are, I guess, the group probably we've talked about most previously, which is the group you tend to think of as sort of red wall voters. Feel slightly overlooked, worried about being left behind, but also, and this is quite important, quite risk averse, don't want to throw everything up in the air, would rather things got better incrementally, did vote Conservative, again, shifted away at the last election. Then got traditional Conservatives who, of all the groups, most do what it says on the tin, economically right-leaning, socially right-leaning, quite sceptical about change, but actually quite optimistic about Britain's future because they're very proud to be British. And then you have the final group that we call dissenting disruptors. This is the group who is most unhappy with the status quo, most uncomfortable with multiculturalism, really feel that they've been overlooked, that elites don't respect them. There is a core of that group who you might call the sort of radical right, who are very online. So that group is about 20%. They're about 5% of them, the more radical group, who actually fundamentally is starting to challenge some democratic norms. The bulk of them, the sort of remaining 15%, are just deeply unhappy and really want change.
And where does this take you? Like, once you've worked out the tribes and once you've worked out the messages that people are giving you run around the country and you actually listen to people the whole time. I mean, where do you go with this? What does it tell you is going to happen here next?
Well, the prize traditionally in electoral politics has been for the party that can build the broadest coalition of those segments. So we're able to look back at people's voting history and find that, you know, Keir Starmer's very broad, almost wins across the segments. In fact, part of the reason, you know, he's got into some difficulties now is he was winning everyone from the progressive activists. Some of whom drifted away to the left.
People were voting not Tory.
Exactly. Boris Johnson also wins this big coalition of the segments. And I guess part of it is, how do you identify the areas which the segments share in common, which is, again, you know, this trust in their neighbours, support for the NHS, most still supporting shared democratic norms. How do you build on that? I think the danger is that outliers in particular groups get seen as representing the whole of that group, so that sort of smaller group of dissenting disruptors is seen as all of reform voters, and every other party thinks you have to chase after that very small slither. And ditto, you know, similar mistakes have sometimes, or misconceptions have been made on the left, that the most progressive of progressive activists represent the left and you've got to chase after them. And actually, it's about realising that you've got to build these broad coalitions. And I think there's challenges for all the parties, including Reform, actually, who are doing very well with dissenting disruptors. But actually, the rooted patriots, who they would need if they would want to win, don't like Donald Trump. Worried about Farage on Ukraine, worried about upheaval. Same with traditional conservatives. So there are risks and opportunities for all parties.
We saw in last year's general election the lowest share for the two main parties since the two main parties were fighting general elections. Are you saying that as a result of this, that is actually going to continue, and so that the idea of two tribes is gone of Labour and Conservative, and we are now these seven tribes, and it will manifest itself in Reform, and it will manifest itself in the Greens, it will manifest itself in, you know, a far left party with Zara Sultana and Corbyn, whatever?
So, I mean, look, the reason we called the report Shattered Britain was a sort of, you know, double meaning. One was that, you know, we have fragmented, and British politics is more fragmented than at any time in recent history, but also shattered in that we are, you know, to use the British version of it, exhausted with the division and divides in politics. It is hard to see at the moment how you glue that back together again. That said, there have been other times in our history when actually, you know, governments have kind of shown that they can get on top of things, and you actually end up bringing people back together. So, you know, I don't like doing crystal ball. For the moment, we are very divided. And I certainly think that left-right axis is much less useful than it ever has been, that you've got to start engaging with, do people think our solutions are complex or simple? That's one of the divides. Do people believe in agency or structural factors? Do they believe that we should roll the dice or play it safe? They're the new dividing lines that I think politicians have to lean into. You know, actually a big one is around speech. You know, is it the most important thing that we have free speech at all costs? Or is it more important that we prevent people from getting offended or worse, even if that means restricting speech? You know, these are the new fault lines.
Does it cut across class?
Yeah, it does. So demographics come out of the model. They don't go into it. So established liberals are more likely to be affluent and well off. It's part of, you know, I guess it informs their kind of comfort that they're least likely to say they're struggling. Dissenting disruptors most likely to be on benefits or in receipt of some government benefits. So they are there. But the interesting thing is you will find people from each of the segments across class as well. And as class, I think, has become a less useful tool for analysing politics, I think these segments get it in a different way that shows you actually people, you know, whether they're upper class or, you know, from working class backgrounds, really want to throw the chessboard up in the air. And that might be more important than their material circumstance.
Well, fascinating.
Yeah.
And just to say that if you want to do the quiz and work out where you are, who you are, where you fit in, on the programme notes for the podcast, you will be able to...
Click the link.
Yeah, click on the link. Lovely to have you with us. Thank you.
Thanks, Luke. Well, you've heard, I guess, a little bit from Luke already about the shape of the country in terms of where those divides come from. Not left and right so much, but cultural questions, social questions, how we respond to information, how we respond to institutions. And we're going to talk now to Zack Polanski, who's running to be the leader of the Green Party, currently the deputy leader, and a member of the London Assembly. The Greens have the same number of MPs in Westminster as Reform, and yet the conversation is very heavily dominated by Reform now, and very little by what the Green Party is doing. I want to quote you a Labour minister who said in May, speaking to The Guardian, "I think we're extraordinarily fortunate that the Green Party are shit. If they had any kind of charismatic or populist leadership, we'd be 8 to 10 points further down in the polls." Do you agree with that analysis?
Well, I've got things to say about the Labour minister, but I'll take the question on directly. I think it's really true that the Green Party has not cut through in the way that we should. We know we have a deeply unequal society where poor people are poorer than they've ever been before. Since COVID, there's more billionaires in this country, and whilst their wealth has doubled, our assets have been stripped away, so people are rightly feeling angry. But I don't think the solutions that Reform offer are going to deal with any of that anger. In fact, they will fuel it and they will make it worse. Nigel Farage is a millionaire who is pretending to serve the working class communities, but actually all of his policies are serving billionaires. We know in this country from this new research that people want to see a wealth tax. They want to see corporations who are destroying our environment, our democracy and our communities pay their fair share. And the Green Party have all the solutions to those things. I think what we've done in the past is we've been too technical. We've been very based in research and science, and that should absolutely stay. But you can't sell research and science to a country. People don't listen to spreadsheets and graphs. We need more emotive storytelling. And I think Farage is the master at that.
So what's your story?
It's a really, really good question. So I think it's about what the green future looks like. And far too often we talk about what we don't want, the kind of dystopian Britain that's full of wildfires and floods. And I think we need to be talking about what cleaner air looks like, what public sector jobs that are building and investing in renewable homes, insulating homes, what it looks like to have beautiful green public spaces, to have arts and culture that's actually invested in by the public sector, where we can have working class communities growing up, being able to tell their own stories. I think there's a really powerful story to tell in this country. And I think the Green Party have been telling it, but we've not had the diversity of messengers to cut through so that people really hear it and can see themselves represented in that story, which is key.
So that's so interesting, because you said that you in the past have been too technical, too scientific, but look at Reform, they are brilliant in the way that they're communicating this stuff. So you need to be more populist like Reform are, but just offering a different way of doing it.
So I'll caveat this with, I despise Nigel Farage's politics.
Yeah, but you're admiring
the opposite.
But you're admiring the way he's selling the message.
Absolutely, the communication style. I don't think anyone can defy that. He's number one in the polls. Before he was even an MP, he caused what I would say is one of the most catastrophic transformations to this country. But you've got to give it to him. He caused it. He made it happen by being bold, by being out there and selling the message. Now, Reform have GB News. They have a 24/7 propaganda machine. They have deep pockets, so they can tell their stories in that way. But it's not enough for me and the Green Party to just complain about it. We've got to be in the mix. And I think the way we do that is by being in communities. So in this leadership campaign, I'm talking about going around the country, as I've been doing for years, and being in those communities, helping them lift up their voices and their stories and telling that story through social media.
But I just wonder whether, look, you know, one of the great things about populism, and you can see it with Trump in America or with Farage here, is you say, here is a complex problem, we've got a really simple solution to it. Whether it be Brexit, whether it be whatever it is in Trump land.
Are you prepared to do that?
Are you prepared to do that?
Yeah, I think we need to reclaim the word populism. So to compare it, I think it's the same as reclaiming patriotism. I don't think there's anything patriotic about Nigel Farage and his vision for Britain. I think a patriotic vision is care for your communities, care for the people in this country who are suffering the worst, and care to say that everybody should pay their fair share. And populism, I think, is ultimately about saying that working class communities, plus the precariat, and all I mean by that is the clues in the title, people living precarious lives. So they're only one day away.
Why would you say precariat then? I mean, like, what's the point of using a word like precariat?
Well,
when you
because I'm
just
not the news agent, so I'm not talking, I think, to the mass public. So I think your audience will
you
understand
are.
what I mean. Yeah, true. I shouldn't.
Hang
tell
on,
my
that
audience.
was patronising to.
Yeah. But what I mean by that, essentially, is that many people are only one day of sickness or one unfortunate circumstance from losing their job, from not being able to pay the rent or the mortgage. So I think it's not about dividing communities. It's recognising that this is about the 99% versus the 1%. So to take your challenge, Emily, because that's fair enough, rather than talking about precariat, I do talk about the 99% versus the 1%. The 1% of a small elite who are controlling our democracy, controlling our politics, and often own the media. We
you
need
use
to
this-
unify.
Yeah, you use this phrase, diversity of messenger. You didn't have a diversity of messenger before. And it does seem to me that Reform thinks they have wrapped up or are wrapping up the working class vote. And I think the Greens would struggle to say that. Your image of a Green voter is somebody who might use a word like precariat, whatever, or, who might put the sort of the recycling before, the kind of talk about the daily grind or the cost of living or whatever. How do you get that working class vote?
It's a really good question. I'd first push back and say, actually, we do have lots of working class voters. And in fact, we have lots of working class councillors and councillors of colour across the country. There's often this stereotype of the Green Party that it's very white and middle class. And actually, it doesn't reflect both in the polling and the representation we've got. However, I totally accept that we want to do more and we want to diversify. And I actually see that as one of my central missions. I want this Labour government to be more scared of losing votes and seats to the Green Party than to Reform.
But they're not.
Exactly. So the way that we do that is making sure we're mobilising all communities, and that the working class community, obviously one of the biggest communities. Now, I don't want it to be them and us. I want it to be one us. Again, this is about a unifying message. It's about saying that if we nationalise our public services, we've got water companies who are pumping sewage into our water and then charging us extra for the privilege. I think that annoys most people, angers them in an incredible amount. We've got wealthy people with assets, and every time you say tax them, people say, but what if they'll leave? But they can't make their assets leave. And I think the majority of the public understand and get this, but Westminster's just in a very different place.
Okay, but Zack, you say there's one us. You want to unify this voice. You have got the Labour Party. There is the Green Party. In Wales, you've got Plaid. In Scotland, you've got the SNP. You've also got now Zara Sultana and Jeremy Corbyn working together. The left has never been, this progressive voice has never been more split.
And that's exactly why I'm running for leader and saying these things, because...
So what, are you saying there should be a grand coalition?
Well, not a grand coalition. I'd like everyone to join the Green Party. We're the party with 4 MPs, 3 London Assembly members, over 800 councillors, and we got nearly 2 million votes at the last election. That's a long way away from Labour's 9 million votes or 10 million votes, but actually that is doable, and that's doable by making sure we're in communities, we're working there, we're fundraising, and actually everyone knows that a Green vote matters, a Green vote can and will win.
But I just saw someone saying that the Green Party up against Corbyn is like a new indie rock band playing against, and you suddenly hear that Oasis are playing in the next door stadium on the same night.
Yeah,
as
this is
you.
Rob Ford, the political
Right,
analyst, right? Who's saying, they've just struck up Oasis right next to you.
Yeah, I'm not going to lie to you. As soon as I heard what Corbyn and Sultana said, I was deeply frustrated. I just thought, why are you doing this when there is a left-wing party? You are having an internal leadership election right now where I'm essentially on the platform that I imagine they would be putting
Have
forward.
you been in touch with them at all?
I talk to MPs all the time, but...
No, have you talked to
Well,
Zara Sultana
the bit
or
I was
Jeremy
going to finish,
Corbyn?
because it answers your question, is then I realised we need to do self-reflection. If they don't want to join the party and people who support them don't want to join the party, we haven't done a good enough job of representing our values. So to answer your question, of course I've been reaching out both publicly and privately to say, if you want this platform, if you want to see this change in the country, then the Green Party already exists and we are a broad coalition of people. And the polling shows that actually the Green Party could and will be much more successful
what's their response?
than a much narrower coalition.
And what's their response?
Well, the response so far is to still be talking about a new party. So I'm clearly not winning that argument yet, but I will keep trying.
So do you think that the answer... I mean, I'm thinking about Luke and his sort of tribes and this idea that people have lost trust with politicians of every stripe to be able to change the country. And they're sort of throwing up their hands and they're saying the institutions don't work, the cost of living's never going to get better for us, our lives fundamentally are never going to change. They've lost that sense of governments delivering. Do you think the answer to right-wing populism, let's say like Reform, is left-wing populism?
Yes, undoubtedly. I don't think it's a rejection of institutions, though. I think the institutions we've had have undoubtedly failed. We've had decades of austerity, both under the Labour government and the Conservative government. So it's not a surprise that most people in this country look at politicians in Westminster and go, are they really representing me? When they're taking donations from private healthcare companies, from oil and gas companies, from arms sales companies. It's not a surprise that's not the politics people want. But I don't think we throw out all our
Okay, so let's talk
institutions in the
about
way
that.
Farage says. I
mean,
think we reform them.
Right, so we've
want
seen
of a better
what
word.
Labour has said about defence spending. We've seen what it wants to do about making defence central to the UK economy now. Would you say we're not going to make arms? There is going to be no factory in the UK that makes arms.
Well, I don't think it's about any factory, but I think there's a big difference between that and £15 billion on nuclear warheads at the same time that we're cutting benefits from disabled people, at the same time that we're talking about a two-child benefit cap, at the same time we're still selling arms to Israel that I believe are committing a genocide in Gaza.
So how many warheads is the right number?
Well, as much as you need for your defence, but I don't think it's about shouting magic numbers. It's in the same way that it went from 2% to 2.5% to 5%. It's clearly incoherent to the majority of the public. And also a percentage of GDP makes no sense, because if the government's suddenly doing very well in terms of economic growth, does that mean you suddenly need a much bigger military, much bigger defence?
So you've talked about withdrawing the UK from NATO, is that right?
No. So what I've talked about is the fact that Donald Trump is threatening to annex Greenland. So people who support NATO would know that triggers Article 5. That would mean we're eventually at war, a world war with Greenland and America. I don't think that's what anyone wants. So rather than just pretending everything is okay with NATO right now, I'm suggesting we talk to our European neighbours. The EU is meant to be a peace project, and talk about building closer alliances with them that are based on peace and diplomacy, rather than allowing this so-called special relationship with Trump, who at the same time brings Zelensky into his office and then absolutely humiliates him. I was disgusted to see how this American president treats the people who should be in our allies.
But just to unpick that, do you want us to stay in NATO?
No. But I also appreciate that leaving NATO right now is not a coherent plan. What is a coherent plan is to recognise the current status is unsustainable and start to say, what does peace and diplomacy look like? Keir Starmer often talks about as being a global leader, a coalition of the willing.
So we'd be out of NATO. In your world, as Zack Polanski as PM, we would be out of NATO.
We would be out of NATO and into an alternative alliance that's based on peace and diplomacy with our European neighbours.
What does that mean?
Well, it means getting around the table and looking at ways of defending our country.
But everyone in Europe thinks that NATO is the best means of defending ourselves.
I don't think that's necessarily true. I think we're
Well,
increasingly...
name me a nation that thinks they'd be better off without... I mean, the reason that the NATO summit came forward with people wanting to pledge more is that they believe that this is the best umbrella for Western security that there is.
Well, first of all, Spain is one country I'd name where famously the leadership are having this conversation. But two, I'd say...
Well, they're not having it about pulling out of NATO. They're having it about whether their defence spending should be up to 5%. That's
right.
Slightly different.
But the kind of logical coherency behind that argument is eventually Donald Trump says no. We know that America control most of the military spending in terms of what they sell to the rest of the countries in NATO. And I think it's just this completely unsustainable coalition. Now, that's sometimes seen as a radical or wildly out of centre position. But actually, I think the radical position right now is to look at global instability in the world, recognise that Donald Trump is holding so many of the keys, and to say all of this is okay. Now, I realise a counter-argument would be stay in NATO, but make America leave it, or have a different alliance to Donald Trump.
What would be our relationship then with America under Donald Trump now?
I think a diplomatic relationship. So, for instance, when I rejected the state visit, I say rejected it, it wasn't my decision, but reject the idea of it. And people said, oh, but that's diplomacy. That's not diplomacy. We don't have to let Donald Trump come into this country and roll out the red carpet. What we do need to do, and I support, is...
So Zack Polanski as Prime Minister would say...
I love how often I'm Prime Minister in this conversation.
It just gets us to a place where I get your views,
Yeah,
like
totally.
Unvarnished views. No state visit with Donald Trump.
Absolutely not.
Five Eyes Agreement?
Well, I mean... It's much more complex in terms of, if we're talking about me being Prime Minister, presumably we're talking further down the road. But ultimately what I think solves some of this conversation is I absolutely would sit down with Donald Trump. Of course you have to sit down with people who have been democratically elected as leaders. You have to have tough conversations with them and negotiations. You do trade deals. Totally on board with all of that. But ultimately what NATO is a nuclear first structure. And I think that's what lots of people in this country are increasingly looking at and seeing that America and Israel illegally bombed Iran. Keir Starmer was not out front and centre condemning that. In fact, he sent implicit codes that that's okay. Tony Brennan, who is the former head of the CIA, hardly a friend of the peace movement, has said that Iran is nowhere near nuclear weapons and they're not an imminent threat. Now, I don't know if that's true or not because I'm not at that level of geopolitics. But I think that's enough to make all of us pause and go, is this really serving our interests? Is this the best we possibly got just because it's what we've already had? What I'm saying is let's use our imagination, let's use our vision, and crucially, experts in geopolitics to say what does peace building look like? What does diplomacy look like?
And would you have diplomatic relations with Israel?
Yes, absolutely. But again, I wouldn't be selling arms with them. I wouldn't be sharing intelligence with them. And I would be very, very strongly condemning what they're doing right now and looking at sanctions. We also know that Benjamin Netanyahu should be arrested for war crimes. And I think the Prime Minister should be absolutely crystal clear on that. That all being said, that is not the Israeli people. And the Israeli people clearly deserve the rest of the world to defend their interests in the same way we should be defending anyone's interests in a global world. So yes, of course, you need to maintain dialogue.
Do you think that there was an overreaction to what happened at Glastonbury?
Yes.
You do?
Yes. I say this as someone who is Jewish. And so I recognise that anti-Semitism needs to be taken really seriously in the same way Islamophobia should be taken really seriously. I also know when they come for one of us, they come for all of us. And so I think the interfaith solidarity I've seen between a lot of the Jewish community and the Muslim community has been wonderful. I also think in a totally separate conversation, the actions of the Israeli government and the Israeli state are totally separate to that conversation, which far too often gets conflated with anti-Semitism. And I think the undertones behind what happened to Glastonbury have serious chilling effects for artists' right of freedom of expression, of being able to have a space where people are able to shout and cheer.
We're talking about Bob Vylan. Just to fill in the gaps.
Yeah, absolutely. Although even as I was saying that, I remember something that Kneecap, because I went to see Kneecap, and they said on stage, was in a few years' time, when history looks back, people will wonder how people had a microphone in front of them at Glastonbury. And even if they weren't going to give a huge political speech, there wasn't a mention from some artists about what's happening in Palestine, what's happening across the world. And that will seem odd to people. It will seem odd to people that people didn't use their platform in this moment to speak out.
Just as a matter of interest, do you think that the people who were calling for riots and for immigrant hostels to be burnt down, that they should have been closed down as well?
I think they should have been arrested. I think that was a very specific threat, and I think there was clearly repercussions.
Well, calling for the murder of IDF soldiers is...
Well, it wasn't the IDF soldiers, they weren't specified, it was the IDF, so we were talking about a military organisation. I just want to caveat here, by the way.
That's the distinction without a difference,
Well, I think it's important. I wouldn't personally ever shout to kill or to murder anyone. It's just not the language I would use, and it's not language I condone. I do think, however, when there's a genocide going on, when you measure those two things together, then it is inconceivable to people that what the government aren't doing is calling out the genocide rather than calling out what an artist has been doing. In the case of calling for asylum seeker hotels to be burnt down, that's actually happened. We had racist riots on our streets last summer. Now, as it happens, do I think the sentence is too harsh? Do I think there were probably other ways of having that conversation in terms of rehabilitation, about education, about awareness? Absolutely. I also accept this is not binary. It's an incredibly complex conversation, as free speech always has been. But I do think we're getting the balance wrong when the mass condemnation and political conversation and discourse was about a rapper on stage shouting rather than the acts that our government are literally not just complicit in but active participants.
Do you think the reaction, and obviously this calls in the BBC and the Director General and all that sort of stuff, the reaction over Bob Vylan has made it easier for the government now to ignore what's happening in Gaza?
Yes, undoubtedly. I think all of this adds to the circus. It all adds to the noise that we've all experienced, that kind of steady drumbeat of doom that I think so many people have experienced. I really notice this when I talk to young people. They're worried about paying their rent, they're worried about bills, they're worried about the climate crisis, and now they're worried about international affairs too. And I think it's very Trump, isn't it, that kind of flooding the zone idea. And now I'm not suggesting the government in some way engineered the Bob Vylan incident, but what I am suggesting is that a media who are often complicit with that government and covering the crimes or the mistakes of that government are willing to say, hey, look over here, there's this other new culture war happening today. And I think it's really important that those of us in politics, but frankly, even more important, that people in communities across the country stick to what's important and focus on what's important. And I, as a politician, make sure in all my communications, I'm really clear that the Green Party message is about lowering your bills, defending the National Health Service, and funding our public services through a wealth tax.
Just a final thought. You talked about broadening the appeal of the Green Party and the stereotypical view of what a Green Party member looks like. Aren't you that person?
No, I don't think I am. I think I had a background for a long time that was totally not in politics. I come from a community theatre background. I think you can't be all things to all people. So sometimes people say to me, you don't strike me as
vegan,
the kind of...
Jewish, Hackney.
Right.
I mean, you know.
I'm not the leader of the working class movement, but nor am I pretending to be. What I am saying is I am the person who will lead the Green Party to facilitate our communities to rise up, to help them to organise, so that the future generation of Green MPs are people I've not even met yet. They're nurses, they're cleaners, they're teachers. They're people who right now might reject politics and say, you know what, I'm not interested in that. It doesn't really represent me. By being on the ground, by really listening to people, by connecting to people in their communities, by proving first at a local level that politics can and will make a difference. That's how I think we change our towns, it's how we'll change our cities, and I think it's how the Green Party can change the country. And anyone who joins the Green Party by July 31st, if they align with our values, gets a vote in this election.
There is a drumbeat now, Zack, isn't there? Do you think this is the last chance for those on the left to beat populism on the right?
I hate not to properly answer your last question, but I try not to indulge in the idea of last chances, or when people say to me, where do you find hope? I just go, there is an urgency to this moment, and actually it doesn't matter if we have other moments or if we don't have other moments. What we've got to do is seize this moment right now.
Let me ask it more specifically. Does it matter if Greens take votes off Labour?
It's one of the most important things that can possibly imagine, because people in this country, working class communities, people of colour, migrants, trans people, disabled people, they need a Green Party right now. They need a stronger Green Party. So when people say to me, is the challenge you're facing right now not a big challenge, or are the odds not all stacked against you? Often they are. But we don't have time to indulge in anything else but growing the Green Party.
No, but what I'm saying is, if you take votes off Labour and Reform get in because Labour is the weaker party, will you feel good about your party?
Well, I think Labour, Keir Starmer needs to reflect on quoting Enoch Powell. I think Labour need to reflect on the fact that they've not protected the communities or the trade unions, the workers that they said they were going to protect. I think Labour need to reflect on the fact that living standards are getting worse. It is in Labour's hands to maintain Labour's chances. It's in my hands to make sure that the country has a proper alternative that's real hope and real change, and that's the Green Party.
Zack Polanski, thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.
Nah, I knew he was going to be here, but I didn't know he was going to be on the stand when we left the trophy, so I was a bit confused, yeah.
So, quiz question. Who is that speaking, and who is he speaking about? Honestly, it is that dinner party game of most unlikely guests you could ever bring together.
Yeah, that is Cole Palmer, the Chelsea forward, who was hoping to lift the trophy without one US president jumping in the way on stage at the MetLife Stadium in New Jersey. And this was as Chelsea were beating Paris Saint-Germain. Quite a moment in sort of footballing history, but one that Donald Trump thought he should be part of.
Very much part of.
Very much.
It wasn't just the question that he handed the trophy. He then stays on the stage for the celebrations, clearly not wanting to leave the stage at all. Chelsea's Reece James is standing there with the trophy, looking over and thinking, what the friggin' hell are you still doing there, Donald?
What I love about this is, like, the only people in the world who would actually just be unafraid of asking that question, what are you doing here? Yeah. They actually say it.
Yeah,
what are you doing here?
What are you doing here?
And I guess they've learned from the Juventus team, who found themselves in the White House with Donald Trump. Do you remember when Donald Trump started asking them about sort of transgender issues and football? And you could clearly see that their captain had sort of said, if the nice orange man asks you questions, just keep quiet. Just don't say anything. Just stare at your shoes. But these guys, no, they're just like, what are you doing here?
So does this mean Donald Trump is Chelsea now? I mean, is that what we've got to live with? I mean, Chelsea are insufferable as a team anyway, from my point of view.
Is there
and
a
now
Chelsea
they've got
golf
Trump
team?
backing them. Jeez, yes, exactly. They'll be playing at Cobham, which is near the Chelsea training ground. Donald Trump will be there. Maybe he'll take in that on the state visit that we know is coming in September. Get a little game at Stamford Bridge. We'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Bye for now.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.